Millionaire farmer found a freezing beggar at a train station. That moment, everything changed. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched in the comments. The wind came in steady, shoving hard from the north across the wide flats of southern Wyoming territory. There wasn't much to catch it, just snowfields, open land, and the sagging bones of a town called Auburn's End. The train only came twice a week now. Most folks had moved on after the mines dried up, and the rest stayed quiet and small, like they didn't want to be noticed by time. Will Langston stepped down from the back of a supply wagon that had groaned its way through 20 miles of ice-cracked road. His boots landed firm on the packed snow, the weight of him sinking in slightly before he straightened and looked around. His coat was heavy and worn from years of use. The buttons didn't match. His gloves were stiff with dried sweat and hay. Nothing about him said wealth except the fact that he could afford to stay quiet, to travel alone, and to take his time. Will owned 4 square miles of land east of town, a ranch called Ash Ridge that stretched past the tree line into hills most men didn't bother to map. He'd made his money quiet, patient, and hard. First in cattle, then in land, then by staying out of other folks' way. 39 years old, with a hard jaw and a face carved by weather. He had a habit of not talking unless he had something to say. Most assumed he didn't feel much either. That wasn't true. He just didn't show it. He came to Auburn's Inn to pick up salt, winter oats, a coil of fencing wire, and a sack of mail, if any had come. The rest he'd already loaded into his sleigh back in Bent Creek. He didn't plan to stay long. The weather had other ideas. The station looked mostly abandoned. Only one lantern burned behind the warped glass of the depot window, and the old wooden sign swayed on rusted nails. Will approached the station door, boots crunching ice with each step. He wasn't thinking about anything more than the list in his coat pocket. Then he opened the door. The heat from a stove barely reached past the center of the room, and it smelled of wet coal and old wood. On the floor beside the stove lay a shape, slumped, still, almost part of the shadows. He paused in the doorway, heart thudding once hard. Then he stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. It was a woman. Thin coat, fingers blue around the knuckles. Her boots were soaked through, one split near the toe. She hadn't moved since he entered. Will knelt beside her without speaking, tugged his glove off with his teeth, and pressed 2 fingers gently to her wrist. There was a pulse, weak but present. He looked at her face, cheeks hollow, lashes stuck together with frost. He touched her neck next. Still breathing, shallow and uneven. He didn't hesitate. He looked toward the agent's desk, empty. No one to help. No one to ask. Will leaned down, one arm under her shoulders, one under her knees. She barely weighed anything. As he lifted her, her head lolled against his chest. He felt her ribs through the coat. She gave a faint noise, something between a breath and a whimper. She was alive, but not for long if he left her there. Will's thoughts moved quickly now. No doctor in Auburn's End. No lodging worth paying for. If she stayed, she'd die before morning. He stepped out into the wind and headed for his sleigh. The storm pressed into his coat and stung his eyes, but he didn't stop. He didn't speak. He laid her carefully in the back, pulled one of the feed sacks aside, and covered her with both spare blankets he kept for nights in the open. He climbed up, took the reins, and turned the sleigh around. It was an hour's ride back to Ash Ridge. He didn't mind. He had wood in the stove, clean water in the basin, and a bed that hadn't been used in years. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't need to know right now. Nora Dunn didn't remember being carried. She remembered the snow. Her feet had gone numb somewhere outside of Gray Hollow, and her stomach had stopped complaining 2 days earlier. She had walked until her legs gave out. That part she remembered. Then the rest became cold and black and quiet. Nora had been on the train heading west. She'd bought a fare to Carson Gulch with her last coins, hoping there'd be work there, a boarding house or a kitchen in need of hands. But someone checked the ticket again 2 towns back. She didn't have the right papers. No more money. The conductor told her to get off. She did. No fight. No words. Just stepped down into the wind and walked. She didn't remember where she stopped. She only remembered thinking her body didn't hurt anymore, which scared her more than anything. She remembered firelight on the edge of her vision. And then, nothing. Now, half conscious, she felt motion. Rough, rocking, her back against something solid, her face against thick cloth that smelled like smoke and horses. She didn't know where she was, but she wasn't cold anymore, and that, somehow, scared her even more. In her mind, there was only one question. Was she safe? Or had someone found her too late? Will didn't speak when they reached the ranch. He pulled the sleigh alongside the barn, gathered her up again, and carried her into the main cabin, his cabin, built with his own hands a decade ago. He hadn't brought anyone into this space since before his wife died, and that had been 8 winters back. He didn't think about it now. He just moved. He laid her on the bed near the stove, stoked the fire, then filled a tin cup with water and left it nearby. She didn't stir. Her breathing was still shallow. He stood beside the bed for a long moment. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but something in him, maybe the part that still woke up in the night thinking he'd hear his daughter's footsteps, told him that leaving her behind would have been a second kind of cruelty. Well, Langston didn't make many decisions quickly, but this one had been clear. A stranger needed help, and he had the means to give it. He'd figure out the rest later. Snow kept falling through the night. Thick, steady, silent. The kind of snow that muffled everything. Will sat in the chair near the stove, elbows on his knees, eyes on the bed where the woman lay motionless under 2 layers of quilts. Her skin was still too pale, her breathing too light. But she was warm now, and he'd managed to get some broth into her, even if most of it ended up cooling on the cup's rim. He hadn't slept. Now and then, his eyes drifted to her boots by the hearth. One of them had split clean across the toe. The soles were thin as paper. She had walked like that, through wind, through snow, through the teeth of winter. And for what? The question sat with him. Will wasn't used to company. He liked silence. He liked order. But something about the way this woman had clung to life without asking for it, it unsettled him. She stirred at dawn. It wasn't much, just a twitch in her hand, then the smallest breath through cracked lips. Will stood slowly, crossed the room. He poured warm water from the kettle into a tin cup, added a drop of honey. He had no medicine, but this would do. She blinked up at him, eyes unfocused, blue, maybe gray. She didn't move, didn't sit up, just watched him, trying to understand if he was real. He knelt, quiet and steady, and offered the cup. Her hands didn't reach, so he lifted it gently to her lips. She drank 3 swallows, then closed her eyes. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked. His voice was low, flat, but not unkind. A moment passed. Her lips parted. "Nora," she said, barely above a whisper. "That's enough," he said. "I'm Will. You're my place. It's warm. You're safe." He didn't ask where she'd come from. Not yet. She looked like someone who'd been questioned too many times and had never been believed. She opened her eyes again and studied his face like she was memorizing it. There was no fear there. Not exactly. Just caution, tired and tight around the eyes. She didn't know him. Didn't know what kind of man found a stranger half dead and brought her home. Will stood and stepped back. Gave her space. He wasn't used to anyone watching him. Especially not like that. He moved through the cabin quietly. Set oats on the stove. Checked the firewood. Pulled on his coat and stepped outside to check on the horses. The snow had covered his tracks already. Everything looked soft and untouched, but the cold cut sharp and deep. He fed the animals, broke the ice in the trough, then looked out across the field toward the ridgeline. The storm would hold a few more days, maybe longer. That meant no trips to town. No help. Just the 2 of them here in silence. Back inside, she'd fallen asleep again. He could see her breathing now, stronger than before. Later that morning, she tried to sit up. Her arms shook, legs too weak to hold her, but she forced herself upright anyway. Will was standing near the counter, cutting cured meat. "You don't have to do anything," he said without turning. "I do," she said, voice hoarse. "You took me in. I didn't do it for thanks." She paused. "You didn't ask who I am. I figured you'd tell me when you're ready." Silence again. She looked around the cabin. Low beams, stacked firewood, a rifle by the door, 2 chairs, 1 table, and a single window facing east. No woman's touch. No curtains. Just a clean, Spartan space built for utility. "You live here alone?" she asked. Will nodded. "Years now." She didn't ask why. He didn't offer. He poured her more hot water and set it beside the bed. This time, she took it with her own hands. They didn't speak again for a while. Nora's mind moved slower than her body. Everything felt fogged, but she remembered enough to know she'd been near the end. If this man hadn't come, she didn't finish the thought. She didn't want to carry that weight right now. She didn't understand why he helped her. Men like him didn't usually notice women like her, not ones dressed in rags with dirt under their nails. But he hadn't looked at her the way other men had. Not like she was trouble, not like she owed him. He looked at her like a person, nothing more. That scared her, because it meant she might owe him something after all. She forced herself to move. She found a brush in the drawer near the wash basin, ran it through her hair in slow, painful tugs. She found a rag and wiped the dirt off her face, then folded the quilt neatly when she stood. She couldn't stand long, but she stood anyway. Well, didn't stop her. She watched him chop wood outside through the window. Precise, methodical, not rushed. Everything he did had a purpose. He didn't fidget, didn't check on her every minute. He just moved like someone who'd spent a long time alone and didn't need anyone watching. It made her feel less like a guest and more like she'd simply arrived, as if she belonged now, even if only by accident. That night, she insisted on setting the table. Her hands were clumsy, but steady. Will cook the same way he did every day: bacon, beans, cornbread. No apologies for the plainness. She ate slowly, watching him. He didn't speak unless she did. But he wasn't cold, just quiet, solid. "Thank you," she said when they were finished. He nodded. "There's clean blankets in the chest. You'll sleep there until you're stronger." And then, Will looked at her, not unkindly. "Then we see." He meant it. No promises, no threats, just space. Nora didn't know if she was safe yet. Not truly. But she was warm, federal alive. For now, that was enough. The next morning came slow, the sky outside gray and low, pressing down over the plains. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to embers. Will rose before first light, same as always, pulled on his coat, and stepped out into the cold. The door closed behind him with a firm thud. Nora sat up in the bed he'd offered her, wrapped in the extra quilt from the chest. Her body still ached, but the shaking had stopped. She'd slept without nightmares for the first time in weeks. That scared her more than she'd admit. Safety felt temporary, borrowed, and she didn't trust borrowed things to last. She got up slowly and moved toward the basin. The water was cold, and it stung as she washed her face. Still, she did it. She brushed her hair back tight and tied it with a frayed ribbon she'd found in her coat pocket. It was all she had left. On the table, a note sat in plain handwriting: "Feeding horses. Coffee's in the pot. Fire needs tending." No signature. No instructions beyond the facts. That was Will. Everything done without fuss. She poured herself coffee. It was bitter and strong and burned going down. She welcomed it. Then she fed the stove, swept the floor with the broom by the door, and folded the second blanket. All of it done quietly, without waiting to be told. She needed to be useful, needed to show him she wasn't dead weight. By the time Will came back inside, she was sitting near the fire, darning one of her socks with a rusted needle she'd found in a drawer. He looked at her, then at the fire, then hung his coat without a word. His boots thudded on the floor as he crossed the room and poured himself coffee. "You didn't have to do all that," he said, voice low. "I know," she replied. "Did it anyway." He nodded once. That was the end of it. They ate together, not saying much. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It just was. He didn't ask questions, and she didn't volunteer anything. But when he set a pair of worn boots on the floor beside her chair, she understood the gesture. They weren't new, but they were whole, dry, and fit her feet when she tried them. She blinked fast once. "Thank you. They were my wife's," he said simply. She kept them cleaned and oiled. "You can have them." That was the first time he'd mentioned her. Nora didn't ask what happened. She saw it in his eyes, that line you don't cross with small talk. Later that day, Will showed her how to stack the split logs by size, how to carry the bucket so the handle didn't freeze your fingers, and how to tie the pantry door shut so the wind wouldn't swing it open at night. He didn't hover or correct her. Just showed her once, then stepped back. She kept up, slow but steady. Her limbs ached from disuse, but she kept moving. It helped her forget how uncertain everything still felt. As the day wore on, Nora's gaze wandered. She noticed details she hadn't before. The rifle by the door wasn't just for show. It had fresh oil on the stock and new rounds in the box beside it. The curtains weren't missing. They'd been taken down, probably years ago. The back room was always closed. But once Winwell stepped through it to fetch something, she saw a glimpse of a small bed and a wooden rocking chair tucked in the corner. Dust-covered but clearly untouched. It told her more than words could have. That night, after supper, she asked something she hadn't dared yet. "Why'd you bring me here, Will?" He didn't answer right away. He set his tin cup down, folded his hands in front of him, and stared into the fire. "Didn't make sense to leave you," he said finally. "You were still breathing." "That's it." He looked at her. Seemed enough. She nodded slowly, studying him. He wasn't being modest. He meant it. She leaned back in the chair, hands resting in her lap. "Most folks would have passed me by. Most folks aren't me." She believed that. By the third night, the routine had settled into something that felt real. She swept. She cooked when she had the strength. And when the cold pressed in hard and deep, she sat near the fire and stitched up old clothes that had been waiting in a drawer for years. She still didn't know what would happen when she got stronger. But the ache in her gut had faded, the color was back in her face, and she no longer flinched every time he entered the room. Still, there was something she hadn't asked, something that needed naming. She set her fork down that evening and looked across the table. "Your wife. She lived here with you." He nodded. "Before the fever. Long time back. Children." He paused, then nodded again. "One. Girl. Died same year." Nora lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." He didn't respond. Just kept eating. The silence hung heavier this time. But it wasn't sharp. Just honest. She understood now why he didn't talk much. He'd already lost everything worth talking about. That night, she stood at the door and watched the snow fall. Will came up beside her, his coat draped over one shoulder, steaming mug in hand. "You could stay through winter," he said. Not as a question, not as a command. "Would that be all right? It's your decision. But you be safe here." She didn't answer right away. She looked out across the white fields and the dark line of pines beyond them. "I haven't been safe in a long time," she said. "Not really. You are now." She looked up at him. His face was quiet, solid, not offering promises, just facts. "I'll stay," she said finally. He nodded once. "All right." The days began to follow a rhythm, one that didn't need to be spoken or explained. The snow outside kept falling in long, steady waves, blanketing the fields and fencing in the world around them. Ash Ridge became its own small universe. Just the cabin, the barn, the animals, and two people learning how to be near each other without making the wrong kind of noise. Each morning, Will was up first. He cut wood, checked the animals, and left the coffee on. When Nora rose, the kettle was already warm. She dressed in silence, still favoring her right leg. The cold still crept into her bones if she didn't move often. But she worked through it. She didn't ask when the storm would end. She stopped asking what would happen after. On the fifth day, she stood at the stove, stirring beans, when she noticed something new, an old calendar tacked to the wall. The year faded, but the month still right. February. The day was marked with a faint pencil line. She turned toward Will. "Why this day?" He didn't look up from his work. He was sharpening the same knife he'd used the night before to slice salt pork. "Daughter's birthday." Nora stayed, quiet for a long moment. How old would she be? Will paused, then answered 7. That was all he said. Nora nodded and returned to the beans. Her hands moved slower now, more careful. When they sat down to eat that night, she made sure the bread was warm and soft and the butter spread smooth. She didn't say it, but he knew she was marking the day, too. That evening, Will opened the door to the back room. It had stayed shut until now. Nora stood in the doorway, uncertain. He didn't look at her, just said, "If you want to use the desk, you can. There's paper, ink, some books too." She used to sit there with her mother. He stepped aside. The room smelled of cedar and thyme. The bed was small, the sheets still folded. A faded dress hung on a peg, untouched. A tiny wooden horse rested on the desk. Nora ran her fingers along the edge of the chair, then pulled it out and sat. She didn't write anything, just sat there for a while, listening to the quiet. The next morning, she asked if she could help with the barn. Will raised an eyebrow. You know horses? No, she admitted, but I can learn. He studied her for a moment, then nodded once. All right. The barn was colder than the house, but the air felt cleaner. Will showed her how to muck the stalls, how to brush the mare's flank with long, steady strokes. He didn't micromanage. He just showed her once and let her figure the rest out. That meant something to her. She asked questions when it mattered. She didn't pretend to know more than she did. That meant something to him. They didn't talk about where she'd come from. But as they worked together, some of it slipped through. I used to cook for a family in St. Louis, she said one morning. They were kind enough. Till the father died. Then I wasn't needed. Will listened without interrupting. They gave me 2 days to leave the house. I packed what I had and took a train west. Thought I'd find work in Carson Gulch. You have kin? He asked. She shook her head. My mother died when I was young. Father drank himself sick. I've been on my own since 16. Will nodded slowly. That part he understood. On the 7th day, the sun broke through. It didn't bring warmth, but it brought color. The snow glittered under it, and the treeline looked less like a prison and more like a border to something else. Will saddled one of the horses to ride out to the edge of the ridge. Nora stayed behind and cleaned the stovepipe, then baked cornbread without being asked. The cabin smelled warmer than it had in days. When he returned, his cheeks were windburned, but he looked satisfied. Drifts are clearing on the South Trail. We'll be able to reach town by next week. She felt something shift inside her at the word town. I don't need to go right away, she said. I didn't say you did. She met his eyes. But you thought I might. We'll set the saddle down and peeled off his gloves. I figure folks ought to go where they want. You came here because you had to. Whether you stay should be your choice. She appreciated the way he said it. Not like an offer, not like a warning. Just a fact. I'm not ready yet, she said. All right. Later that night, after supper, she asked him if he'd always planned to stay alone. He stared into the fire for a long time. Didn't plan anything. I built this place because I needed to. After they died, I kept building. Didn't want to be in town. Didn't want to talk to people who didn't know how to look at you after you lost something. She understood that. Too many people had looked at her like she was only made of what she'd survived. I don't want to be a burden, she said softly. You're not. How do you know? Because I watch. And I see you trying. That's enough. That was the most personal thing he'd said since she arrived. She looked at her hands, then at the fire. I don't want to leave. You don't have to. That night, the wind outside shifted. It wasn't as sharp. The storm had passed. There was no conversation about what tomorrow would bring. They didn't need one. For now, they had warmth, steady work, and 2 cups on the table instead of one. The sun held steady in the sky for 3 days. The snow began to melt in places along the south-facing slope of the barn, at the edge of the corral fence, around the roots of the pines near the creek. It wasn't spring yet, but something had shifted. The silence in the air no longer felt heavy. It felt expectant. Will repaired the fence post by the west pasture that morning. Nora stood nearby with a coil of wire over one shoulder, holding the hammer when he reached for it. She didn't say much, but she didn't need to. She watched, learned, moved with him. They worked in rhythm now. She'd started calling the place home in her thoughts. Not out loud. Not yet. But it settled in her quietly, like the way her body no longer flinched at every sound, or how she'd begun folding her blankets without rushing, knowing they'd still be there tomorrow. Later that day, while Will was in the barn, she found a box of folded letters tucked behind a stack of seed sacks. She hadn't meant to snoop. She'd been looking for a tin of oil for the sewing machine he'd fixed up the day before. But the letters had names on them she didn't recognize. Margaret Langston, Eleanor, James F. Harper. When Will returned, she didn't mention the box. She didn't open a single letter. But she asked gently, "Do you get mail from family?" He gave a quiet shrug. "Used to. Not much anymore. Do they know about what happened here?" They knew once. Then life moved on. People get busy. They don't mean to forget, but they do. She thought about that, then asked, "Why didn't you go to them?" He looked her straight in the eyes. "I didn't want to be someone they pitted." Nora understood more in that one sentence than she could have from 100 letters. That evening, Will lit the lamp early. A draft had slipped through the northern wall, and he was patching it with thick canvas while she stirred the pot. The stew simmered loud, rich with carrots and salted beef from the cellar. I was wondering something, she said quietly, not turning from the stove. Well, didn't stop working, but he listened. When I was near frozen back in that station, how did you know I was alive? He looked up. I didn't. Not for sure. Then why carry me out of there? That was a risk. Will stood and brushed dust from his hands. I don't know. Something about the way you were holding your hands. Like you hadn't given up yet. She didn't respond right away. Then she said, "You were right." It wasn't a long conversation, but it stayed with both of them. Over the next few days, Will began showing her more of the land. He guided her past the property line, down into the low basin near the frozen creek. He pointed out where the wild berries grew in June, where the bear tracks had passed last fall, and which trees marked the edge of safe ground when storms rolled in from the west. "You know all this by heart," she said. He nodded. "I don't forget what keeps me alive." She paused, then said, "Maybe I could learn it too." He stopped walking, looked at her, then gestured toward the line of trees. "All right, let's start with how to read tracks." That night, as the wind died and the fire crackled low, Nora sat with an old journal on her lap. Will had given it to her after finding it in the drawer beneath the desk. Blank pages, leather-bound, with only one name written on the inside cover, Yell. Nora didn't ask who that was. Instead, she opened the first page and wrote, "I don't know what I'm staying for yet, but I know I'm not ready to leave." On the sixth day of sun, a rider came. Nora saw him first through the cabin window. A lean man with a travel-stained coat, slouched shoulders, and a quick way of dismounting like he wasn't used to standing still. The horse was thin. The man didn't knock. He stood at the fence and waited, eyes scanning the house, the yard, the woods behind it. Will stepped out, rifle resting in the crook of one arm. He didn't raise it, just held it like a man used to trouble. "Looking for someone?" Will asked. "I might be," the man said. His voice was slow, smooth. "Looking for a woman. Said to be headed west. About yay tall, brown hair. Said she was begging on train platforms near Gray Hollow." Will didn't move. "You law?" "No," the man said. "She owes money to someone who thinks she ran off with it." Nora had stepped quietly onto the porch by then. She didn't hide. She didn't look afraid. "I didn't take anything," she said. "He gave me the coins for the fare and told me not to come back." "I didn't." The man looked her over. "Then he wants the money back." "I don't have it." Will stood between them now. "She's under my roof. You'll ride out now." The man tilted his head. "You'll take on her debt?" "I didn't say that. I said she's under my roof." "That's enough." The rider studied Will, saw he wasn't bluffing. Then he turned without another word, mounted up, and rode east. Will didn't speak for a long time. Finally, as they stood on the porch in the fading light, he asked, "That man tell the truth?" Nora nodded. "About the debt? Yes, but not the rest. I didn't steal anything. I just took the chance to leave when I had it." He nodded once. "All right, why'd you back me up?" "Because you didn't lie when it counted." That night, she moved the tin cup on the table beside his. He didn't say anything when he saw it, but he brought in 2 coats from the barn before turning in for the night. Hers and his, set them side by the door, like it was always meant to be that way. The rider didn't return. We'll check the trail twice over the next week, both east and south, making sure the snow held no new prints. The man had gone, but a new tension remained, not spoken, not heavy, but present, like a door left slightly open in the back of Nora's mind. She didn't mention it again. She kept busy instead, chopping kindling, stitching worn shirts, learning to cook meals without wasting. Let her do things her way. He never hovered, but he noticed. He always noticed. One morning, while feeding the chickens, she asked, "What would happen if he came back? Or someone worse?" "We'll set the grain bucket down. Then I deal with it. You put yourself in danger for me." He shook his head. "It's not about danger. It's about deciding what's worth standing in front of." She looked at him then, really looked. There was no pride in his voice, no posturing, just fact, like saying which way the wind blew or how deep the snow fell. That was the moment Nora stopped wondering whether this place was temporary. A few days later, a wind rolled down from the northern hills, and with it, a different kind of cold. It wasn't the bite of deep winter. It was the return of movement. Meltwater streamed under the snowpack, cutting shallow lines through the fields. Birds started to return to the trees. The rhythm of the land changed, and Will changed with it. He began taking longer walks along the ridge, checking fence lines, studying animal tracks. Nora asked if she could come along, and he didn't say yes or no, just handed her a scarf and told her to wear better boots. As they walked, she asked more questions. Not the kind that filled silence, but the kind that cleared it. Did you ever think about starting over somewhere else? Once. What stopped you? He looked down at the trail ahead. I was still waiting for something to come back. Took a while to realize it wouldn't. She walked quietly beside him, stepping over the same frozen ditch he did. And now, I don't think anything's coming back, he said. But something else showed up. That evening, she found a cedar box under the bed while sweeping. It was light, almost empty, with only 2 items inside: a locket and a baby shoe wrapped in cloth. She didn't open the locket. She didn't need to. When Will saw her sitting beside the box later, he didn't flinch or close the space between them. He just said, her name was Clara, born in this house, died just past her 2nd birthday. Nora looked down. You kept this all this time. I couldn't throw it out. She nodded once, then gently closed the box and slid it back under the bed without a word. He watched her do it, jaw tight. She didn't ask about the mother. Not yet. The next day, Will brought in a package from town, delivered late by a passing neighbor who'd made the trip for supplies. Inside was cloth, needles, thread, and a bag of sugar she hadn't asked for. Nora unfolded the fabric carefully. You remembered the color I liked. He shrugged. You said it made the kitchen feel warmer. She smiled. That's not why you bought it. No, he admitted. I thought you'd do something with it. I will. She did. The next few days, she worked at the sewing table in the back room. Curtains first, then napkins, then a new shirt for Will, sturdy, dark brown, with tight seams and brass buttons. He didn't comment when she gave it to him, just wore it the next morning like it had always belonged to him. Later that week, while setting traps near the creek, Will found her sitting alone on a rock, face toward the wind, hands wrapped around her knees. You all right? She nodded slowly. I just haven't stopped moving since I got here. I think I needed to. And now I'm not sure what to do with stillness. He thought about that. Takes time. You don't have to figure it all at once. She looked at him, eyes steady. Did you? He let out a quiet breath. No, I just stayed put until I didn't feel like leaving anymore. She smiled faintly. I think I'm getting close to that. The next night, she asked the question she'd been carrying for weeks. Your wife, what was she like? Will didn't answer right away. He set down the tin cup in his hand and stared into the fire. Margaret was quiet. Like me, she kept to herself unless she had something to say. Didn't complain. She liked order, and she liked the sound of storms. Said it reminded her that nothing stayed still forever. Nora nodded. Did she pass during the same sickness as Clara? He shook his head. Year before. Childbirth. Clara was born early. Margaret didn't make it. I raised her alone until the fever came. That answered more than she'd asked, but she didn't interrupt. I kept the house the same ever since, he added. Didn't know what else to do. And now, he met her eyes. Now it's not the same anymore. That night, Nora added a second line to her journal. Some houses aren't haunted. They're waiting to be lived in again. She closed the book and set it beside her cup on the table. And this time, she didn't move it away. The thaw came quietly. No announcement, no dramatic break. Just a day where the snow didn't fall, and another where the icicles at the eaves let go of their grip and dripped into the dirt. The wind softened. The cabin no longer creaked at night. And Nora, for the first time, left her shawl off inside. Will spent most mornings out in the pasture now, assessing winter damage, fencing, tools, the lean-to near the shed. Nora joined him more often, sleeves rolled up, work gloves too large for her fingers. He didn't correct her when she stacked the lumber unevenly or fed the chickens too much grain. He watched, gave her space to adjust, to figure things out by doing. She liked that about him. He didn't try to fix her. He just let her move forward. One afternoon, while they stood at the edge of the corral tightening rope, she asked without warning, Do you ever think about going back east? Wood didn't glance at her. No. Why not? He adjusted the tension, then leaned back against the fence rail. Because the only thing I left behind was a version of myself I don't want to see again. Nora nodded. That made sense. She felt the same about Illinois. There were no roots to dig up, just ghosts she'd already buried. Later that week, Nora found herself alone for half the day. Will had ridden north to check the water line near an old collapsed mill. She used the time to clean the stovepipe, beat the rugs, boil linens. Not because it needed doing, but because she wanted the space to feel lived in, not just endured. While folding the dry wash, she stopped and looked at the small glass pane above the kitchen sink. Her own reflection surprised her. Her cheeks weren't hollow anymore. Her eyes weren't wide with exhaustion. She looked ordinary and strong and still there. She stepped outside and stood in the light. The snow was gone from the walk. She followed the trail to the barn, slow and quiet, just thinking. Inside, she found a leather-bound ledger tucked beneath a sack of oats. Not hidden, just placed where time had forgotten it. She opened it. Inside were notes. Ranch expenses, cattle counts, repairs logged in Will's rough handwriting. But between the entries, something else caught her eye. Smaller lines. Sentences that didn't match the rest. Snow too deep to ride, but the wind cleared west. No word from town. Doesn't matter. Dreamed of Clara again. Don't remember the sound of Margaret's voice anymore. Nora sat there, holding the book open in her lap, heart pulled tight. He'd written these over years. Not for anyone else. Just so something inside him wouldn't rot away in silence. When Will returned, dusk already sinking low, he found her sitting on the barn rail, the ledger closed beside her. "You found it," he said. She nodded. "You ever think of writing her back?" He shook his head. "No use writing what can't be read. Sometimes it's not about who reads it." He didn't answer. But that night, when she left the book on the table, he didn't put it away. The days grew longer. The paths turned to mud. Will and Nora rode into town together for the first time since her arrival. It wasn't a formal decision. He'd simply said, "Need supplies." And she'd said, "I'll go too." She dressed in the boots he gave her, the coat he patched, and the dress she'd mended herself. No one in Auburn's End remembered her from the station. That didn't surprise her. When you look half dead, people tend not to really see you. But they saw her now. At the general store, Will gave her room to speak. When the storekeep asked what they needed, he turned to her. She answered clearly: flour, dried beans, a bolt of muslin, 2 new spools of thread. No one questioned it. No one asked who she was. Later, as Will loaded the goods into the wagon, the storekeeper pulled him aside. "She your wife?" Will looked back at her, brushing snow from the back step. Then answered, plain and steady, "She's mine." On the way home, she asked, "Was that true?" Will kept his eyes on the road. "Only if you wanted to be." She didn't reply right away. She thought about what that meant, being someone's. Not owned, not owed, but chosen. "I do," she said finally. "Then it's true." That evening, as the sun set behind the ridge, Nora stood in the doorway with a clean towel in her hands and watched him split wood. Not because she needed anything. Not because she was waiting. Just because she was home. The ground turned firm again by early April. The last frost passed in a night, so still it felt ceremonial. The fields began to breathe, damp earth rising beneath boots, the smell of thawed grass drifting through the cabin windows. Will repaired the gate to the southern pasture that week. Nora helped, handing him nails, holding the board steady, sleeves rolled past her elbows. Neither said it aloud, but the air had changed. Winter had retreated, and what remained felt like the beginning of a life instead of the end of one. Inside the house, things were no longer just functional. A length of muslin now covered the kitchen table. A clean tin cup sat on each side of the shelf. 2 coats hung by the door, not one. The back room, once sealed like a memory too raw to touch, was now used again. Only partly and gently, but with life. Nora used the desk to write letters she didn't send. Will stored his tools neatly beneath it. That Sunday morning, Nora swept the porch clean. Will stepped out and handed her a folded paper from town. "Letter came for you." Her name was written in a cramped, familiar scrawl. She opened it slowly, eyes scanning each line as her grip tightened. When she looked up, her mouth was set firm. "It's from a man I used to work for," she said. "One of the sons. He says the man who sent that writer after me died last month. Left no will, no claim on me or anything else. Will waited. He says if I want, I could return. Says the family name wouldn't stop me anymore." Will didn't speak. Nora folded the letter. Her jaw moved once. I'm not going. Didn't figure you would, Will said. I just wanted you to hear me say it. I did. She walked over and handed him the paper. He didn't read it, just tossed it into the stove and shut the door. Later that week, they worked side by side building a new chicken coop closer to the cabin. The old one had rotted through at the base. Will sawed the planks. Nora hammered. They didn't talk much, but the quiet was no longer a barrier. It was rhythm. She didn't need to look for approval anymore. He didn't second-guess her presence. It was as if the cabin, the land, the air itself had absorbed her shape. That night, she asked something simple. What do you want this place to become? Will thought for a long moment before answering. Used to think survival was enough, just keeping the place going. And now I think maybe it could be something built for more than one. She nodded. Then I'll build it with you. It wasn't a promise in the way folks understood vows, but they both heard it that way. A few days later, while organizing the back room, Nora found a small tin box wedged behind the desk's leg. Inside were old photographs, faded, cracked, but intact. One showed a young Will, arms around a smiling woman. Another showed a baby wrapped in a thick blanket, tiny hand clutching someone's finger. She brought them out to the table and laid them gently in front of him. Will stared at them for a long while. You should have these where you can see them, she said. He didn't answer, but later that night, he placed one in a frame and set it on the mantel. The next morning, as the sun rose behind the ridge, Nora woke before him. She brewed coffee, set 2 cups down, then stood at the edge of the doorway and looked out. Everything was quiet, but wasn't the empty kind. It was a living quiet, a silence full of things worth keeping. She turned and saw him watching her. I want to stay, she said, as if it hadn't already been decided. I know, he said. I already made your place here. She smiled. I made mine too. The days lengthened. The soil warmed. Spring settled in without drama, just steady, certain change. Green spread along the banks of the creek. The chickens scratched further from the coop each morning. The porch steps stayed dry now. Nothing urgent pressed against the horizon, but everything was in motion. One morning, Will stood in the field, hand resting on a fence post he'd driven into the ground nearly 10 years ago. He looked over the land with a quiet expression, as if measuring what was still strong and what had begun to lean. Nora approached from the cabin, carrying a small basket of laundry. She didn't speak until she was beside him. Something on your mind? He gave a slight nod, thinking of building another room on the west side. She glanced over. What for? He shrugged. Storage. Maybe a workshop. Or maybe a room with windows. One you can sit in after chores. Read in when it's too hot outside. He looked at her. You'd use a room like that? I think we both would. He didn't answer, but that evening he drew up plans on scrap parchment. Clean lines. A simple structure. Nothing grand. Just something made with care. That week, Will traveled alone into town to meet a man about lumber. It was the first time he'd gone without Nora since winter. She stayed behind willingly. There was bacon due, spring onions to dry, linens to mend. But when the sun dipped low and he hadn't returned, her chest pulled tight in a way she hadn't felt since the day she collapsed in the station. He arrived just after dark, boots heavy with mud, a cut on his forearm from a slipped harness buckle. Didn't mean to worry you, he said simply, after stepping inside. Nora didn't scold or ask questions. She walked over, took his coat, and wordlessly began cleaning the cut. Will watched her hands. There was a time I would not have told anyone if I was hurt. She pressed a cloth to the wound. And now I figure if I don't tell you, you'll notice anyway. She wrapped the bandage snugly. That's right. He caught her hand before she pulled away. Held it, not tight, not urgent, just steady. She didn't move. I never thought I'd need anyone again, he said. And I never thought needing would feel like this, quiet like breath. She looked up at him. It's not needing. It's sharing. He nodded once. Let go of her hand. The next few days were spent framing the new room. They worked in tandem, Will cutting beams, Nora measuring, the two of them raising walls that didn't yet hold a roof, but already gave shape to something permanent. They didn't rush. The pace matched the land around them. Deliberate, useful, grounded. One afternoon, while setting the crossbeam, Nora paused and looked at him across the frame. Do you ever think about what this would have looked like if things hadn't gone the way they did? She asked. Will wiped sawdust from his hands. Sometimes, but I don't stay there long. Why not? Because I wouldn't trade what I have now, even if it meant never losing what came before. She stood very still. That doesn't mean I don't miss them, he added. It just means I know the difference between memory and possibility. That night, they ate on the porch. The stars were sharp above them, the air clean with the scent of pine and fresh soil. Will handed her a folded paper he'd brought from town, a notice about a traveling judge passing through in 3 weeks. Legal matters, small claims, marriages. Nora read it, then folded it again and set it beside her cup. She didn't say anything. Will watched her. I don't need it, he said. I know, she replied. But I might. He nodded. We'll go if you decide. I'm not in a hurry, she said, but I want it known that I chose you, that I stayed because I wanted to, not because I had nowhere else. You made that clear long ago. Not to the world. They left the paper on the table. No decision yet, but no fear in the not knowing. Later that night, as Will banked the fire and Nora folded the last of the dry linens, he asked, what would you want written if someone came asking years from now? She thought for a long time before answering. That I arrived with nothing and built something worth keeping.